Well, hello, everybody. I can't see you, but it's great to sense your presence. And I imagine that many of us right now are on the UW campus. So we're sharing a space in some ways. And I'm just really excited to be able to talk with you today, this morning, about my book that I recently published in March, Technology's Child, and just share with you some highlights about the book. But I first want to set the stage by talking about how I'm coming to this talk and the book. And really, I'm coming to it wearing two hats. And here, I'll pause to just ask you to consider the hats that you're wearing as you come to this talk and going through your day today. And feel free to share those hats in your chat. I imagine you're wearing your professional hat, of course, on this Tuesday in November. But what other hats might you be bringing to this topic of kids and technology? So for me, I am a researcher, and as Anna mentioned, I direct the Digital Youth Lab at the University of Washington. I can't believe I'm in my 12th year now at UW, and I love it even more than I did the first day that I started. And also as a parent, I come to this topic of kids and technology. I'm raising my 6-year-old son, Oliver, and he features prominently in the book. And every day not just when I'm researching technology and kids, but also as I'm living it as a parent. So I can't help but wear both of these hats when I'm thinking about kids and technology. And so just a little bit of background about me, just to add to what Anna said. For almost 20 years now, I've been studying young people's digital experiences. And I use the insights from my empirical research to design positive technology experiences that support learning, development, and well-being. And so a lot of my work is actually, it's a lot of fun. I get to engage in co-design with young people and imagine better technology than they currently are experiencing. And over those 20 or so years, whenever I've been asked outside of UW, what do I do? Maybe my friends or at a cocktail party or something like that. And I say, I study kids and technology, invariably that raises some eyebrows, and I often will get some sort of question like, well, how bad is it? Or, what's the verdict? Is technology good, or is it bad for kids' development? And for most of my professional life, I have been pretty comfortable giving an answer like, it's complicated, it depends. On the one hand, for some kids, it can be good. On the other hand, it can be harmful in certain contexts. And, I've been pretty satisfied for most of this time giving this kind of answer, because I feel like it does justice to the complexity of the research. And I personally, as a researcher, I love digging into that complexity and the nuance of kids' digital experiences. And I'm very comfortable with these kinds of statements. However, about 6 years ago, when I became a parent, I realized that I just needed some concrete answers. I needed to know how many episodes of Paw Patrol are too many. And then looking forward, I needed to know, well, when should I introduce Oliver to video games? That's a really big question right now, as he's about to turn 7 and desperate to have a video game console in our house. And then, soon after that, I'm going to be thinking about, when should I let him have a phone and what sorts of capabilities should it have on it? And so when I became a parent and started confronting these very concrete day-to-day questions, I started to wonder if there was anything useful that I'd learned as a researcher that could help me as a parent. And that was really the motivation for writing Technology's Child. It was this tension between my role as a researcher and my role as a parent that drove me to explore whether there was anything concrete that could be distilled from this very complex and ever-changing research landscape. And I wanted these concrete insights, if there were any to be had, to be useful for parents like me, but also other people who have children or youth of any age in their lives, such as teachers, policymakers, and tech designers. And hopefully that there could be some insights that could be used to support children's positive digital experiences. So this book is really my attempt to bring my researcher self and my parent self together. And also in the process, I bring in other roles such as teacher, instructor, and also big sister, which I will talk about a little bit later in the talk. Now, as a developmental scientist, I wanted to look at the full arc of child development from early childhood to emerging adults, zooming in on one or two areas that are central to development at each of these critical stages. So in early childhood, I looked at the development of self-regulation and early literacy skills, which are really fundamental in those early years. I examined play and learning in middle childhood. Moving into the tween and teen years, I looked at changing family and peer relationships, as well as the development of one's identity. And finally, in emerging adulthood, I looked at young people's civic engagement and how they do that with technology, network technologies. And so for each of these areas, I pulled out what research tells us about what kids need to thrive at each stage of development. And I also examined existing research on kids and technology. And as this slide indicates, I looked very broadly across many disciplines. I'm here in the information school. We are a very interdisciplinary school with many different sorts of scholars represented. And my research has been influenced by a lot of different disciplines. And I also drew not just on research that others have conducted around this topic of kids and technology, but also my own. A lot of my research is focused on identity development, peer and family relationships, particularly in the teen years, as well as how technology can support and unfortunately sometimes undermine learning and young people's well-being. So as you can imagine, this was a lot of research to pull together. And as if you see the book, you'll see that like a big chunk of it is footnotes. There are over 1,000 citations. The footnotes are pretty lengthy, but this was my attempt to take all of that research and distill it so that you don't have to. There were definitely times in this book where I was writing it and thinking, this is too much. Why did I decide to look at the full arc of child development? Why couldn't I just focus on the teen years, for instance? Because that's typically where I focus most of my work. But then, I plugged away throughout the pandemic, and I started to find a signal in all of this noise. And what really helped me was really focusing in on a particular question. And it was this question of when does technology support child development and when does it not? And I found that although certainly the research is very complex, there are many it depends kinds of answers out there, including from my own research. But even so, I was able to detect a signal, which I developed into a two-part framework that can be stated in just a single sentence to answer this question. So digital experiences that are self-directed and community supported are best for children's healthy development. And in my talk this morning, I'm going to dig into each of these components, bringing in examples from the book and many from my own life as well and research. So I want to start first with self-directed technology experiences. These are experiences that place children in the driver's seat of their digital interactions. So the agency is with the child rather than with the technology. And one of the examples I explore in my book is children's digital play. And as I do with each area of development that I cover in the book, I begin with what makes play so important to development. And sometimes we tell kids, oh, go off and play, or we look at them playing. We kind of don't really take it very seriously. But there is a lot of learning that's taking place when kids are engaged in play, and particularly imaginative play. And some of the skills that are developed, I have added on this slide, but these are just a small fraction of all the different skills that kids are developing. So they're learning to transform their thinking from concrete thinking into symbolic thinking as they engage in play. They're learning counterfactual reasoning. What if I had done this instead of this? Would it have changed the result? They're learning when they negotiate, especially with their friends during gameplay, they're realizing, oh, wait a second, my friends have different ideas of the situation than I have. They have a different perspective. And in that process, they're developing their interpersonal skills, their sense of fairness, what's right and what's wrong. And also when things are not going their way, they have to learn how to regulate their emotions. So there's a lot going on when kids play. However, not all play is created equal. Not all play experiences are equally supportive of these kinds of skills. So the question becomes then, what kinds of play experiences are best for children's development? And we'll consider this first in the analog world without bringing in the digital just yet. First, there are lots of different kinds of play. All are important to development, but arguably open-ended, self-directed play is one of the most important types for children's cognitive and social development. Flexible, open-ended experiences like playing with old boxes give children more opportunities to come up with their own plot lines and their own actions. It gives them an opportunity to test things out, to observe the results and adjust accordingly, kind of like a scientist would. If they're playing with other children, so here Oliver is playing with his stepsister, they have to negotiate questions of fairness and practice looking at a situation from someone else's perspective. Now, one way of thinking about the affordances of playing with things like cardboard boxes is with the concept of loose parts. This concept comes from the late sculpture professor, Simon Nicholson, and I first encountered it in Alexandra Lang's excellent book, The Design of Childhood. Nicholson argued, and later research supports, that children's play is enriched by the availability of loose parts in their environment. So with loose parts, children create their own worlds instead of playing within the boundaries of someone else's design. And this kind of open-ended, self-directed play is critical to development, supporting skills like emotion regulation, counterfactual reasoning, and social understanding. Now, of course, there are lots of loose parts to be found outdoors, including sand and dirt, which are perhaps the ultimate loose parts. Here is Oliver just a couple of months ago over Labor Day weekend at Cape Disappointment, which was fantastic. If you haven't been there for camping, I highly recommend it. But he made good use of the loose parts of the sand on the beach. But the question is, do loose parts exist in digital form? How do you transfer sand or dirt into the digital landscape? So to answer this question, let's take a look at two different digital play experiences. Peppa's Paint Box and Paw Patrol Rescue Run. Both of these apps are currently on Oliver's tablet. And over the last few years, he's enjoyed playing with both of them, especially when he was around 3 or 4. Right now, he's 6, going on 7. But as I'll show, the kind of play experiences they offer are actually pretty different. So we'll start with Peppa's Paint Box. And so when Oliver opens the app, he's taken to a blank canvas. He can choose the drawing tool that he wants to use. First, he selects a blue paint can because blue is his favorite color. And he's pretty happy that this can turn the whole canvas blue. So he decides, a little bit of usability issues there, but he decides to make the whole canvas blue. And then he can start drawing freely. He can choose his drawing implement, draw whatever he wants. It's, he's deciding how he's going to draw. Then he goes through and chooses some little stamps. They've got some cute stamps, these little flowers that grow. And he gets kind of carried away with that. He likes these stamps. So you fast forward a bit and this end product's not going to end up probably in the Louvre, but he's happy. He's had a bit of fun. And his all of his friends in the app have gone ooh and ah. Now, Paw Patrol Rescue Run is quite different. I'm not going to bore you with a video of him playing Paw Patrol Rescue Run, but I'll just describe it. He starts off with this choosing one of several missions. Each of these missions has a very clear and singular objective involving getting from one place to the end of a set course as efficiently as possible. And these are pretty good missions. They're pretty pro-social, cleaning up Adventure Bay and things like that, helping a friend out. These are good things, I would argue. But the actions and pacing are all predetermined by the designers of the game, and they all point in just one forward direction. The pup treats and the badges that children can earn along the way keep them playing for as long as their parents will let them. Far longer, for instance, than Oliver would typically engage with Peppa's paint box. Now, when we put these two digital play experiences side by side and ask who's in control here, the child or the app, I would argue that Peppa's paint box allows for a more self-directed experience. And why is that? Well, it's a very open-ended and self-paced experience where, you open the app and you just have a blank canvas and you get to figure out what you want to do after that. And you get to figure out how fast or how slow you're going to go and when you want to end. There's nothing that's kind of compelling you to keep in this app environment. When you're done with your picture, you're done and you move on. And typically what I've noticed with Oliver is a play session with Peppa's paint box is about 10 or 15 minutes, which is about the length of a play session typically with offline toys. It's getting a little bit longer as he gets older, for sure. There are certainly a lot of loose parts. You could even say that the blank canvas is itself a loose part. The choice of drawing implements and color palette, all of those things Oliver gets to decide. And there are notable absence of dark patterns in the design. Now, dark patterns are things like time pressures, game characters, virtual rewards, and navigation constraints that really try to keep kids inside of whatever app that they're playing with. So there are things like game characters who will cry if you exit the app, time pressures like trying to beat the clock, virtual rewards to keep you playing, much longer than you might ordinarily, and even navigation constraints, like things like making it difficult to find your way home, that if you can't find your way home, you're kind of probably more likely to keep playing. So basically, dark patterns such as these are designed specifically to keep people engaged on a platform than they might, longer than they might otherwise. And so, with Paw Patrol, the promise of collecting more pup treats, more badges, keeps Oliver playing for much longer than he would probably play Peppa's paint box. And generally speaking, the question, who's in control, the child or the technology, is core to determining whether a digital experience is self-directed or not. And it can be applied to a range of tech experiences across different stages of development. So it's not just focused on early childhood, which I used as an example, but it goes across the full arc of development. And hopefully the two examples that I showed help to illustrate how important design is when it comes to answering this question, who's in control? The presence or absence of loose parts, the presence or absence of dark patterns, whether it's self-paced or system-paced, all of these things will help determine whether a digital experience is more or less self-directed. Now, I want to add a small coda here before moving on from digital play to slightly older children. I think it's worth noting that digital loose parts are perhaps not quite as loose as they are in the analog world. So certainly Peppa's Paintbox is a very open-ended, self-paced app. But still, when it comes to painting, there is a limit to what you can do compared to analog painting. So with actual paints, you can mix colors and create new colors. You can only do that in an app if the developer has programmed that capability into the app. And even then, there will be limits to the gradations of shades that you can create. There are no such limits in the analog world. So generally speaking, loose parts are somewhat easier to find in the analog world and somewhat less loose in the digital world. Okay, so moving on, now that we've got a sense of what a self-directed experience looks like in early childhood, let's take a look at what self-directed digital experiences do and don't look like for teens during adolescence. And here I'll dig a bit deeper into not just how design matters, but also the role of individual children and the characteristics that they bring to a digital experience, as well as their surrounding social context, because all of those things are really important. So first, as we did with play and early childhood, let's take a look at what's front and center developmentally during adolescence. Now, heading into adolescence, generally family relationships start to change, certainly not for all kids and not in all cultures, but often at least in the United States context, figuring out how to establish greater autonomy within the context of continued connection to your parents as teens move away, but not totally disconnected from parents, and towards their peers. And as they make that shift, peer relationships start to take center stage. This is the place where teens are figuring out who they are in relation to their peers and to the broader society. They also start to think about what roles they might take on, including their career roles and their civic roles. This is critical work. This is a job that's every bit as important as your job or mine. And it's within this developmental context, digital experiences tend to center around peer interactions, identity expression and exploration, and civic expression. And, that's not surprising given what teens are doing developmentally during this stage of development. So what makes these digital experiences more or less self-directed? Now, loose parts may not apply exactly to this situation, but the idea of agency certainly does. And again, it comes down to who is in the driver's seat, who's in control of their digital experiences. So first, let's look at the good stuff. In my research, I found lots of good things, lots of evidence of teens engaged in self-directed digital experiences, whether it's developing their interests and skills, exploring and finding support for an emerging identity, and connecting with others and experiencing community in different online communities. Many teens have these kinds of experiences. And it's one reason why it's so tricky when we are very quick to condemn social media, because yes, there are bad things happening with social media, but there are also good things happening too. And it's just really hard when the good and the bad is kind of all jumbled up together. So I want to use as an example of the good, before we move into some of the less good things, more of the challenges, I want to use my younger sibling, Molly, as an example. So I talk about Molly in the book. And although we are siblings, Molly's birth in 1996, when I was a senior in high school, you can do the math there, that makes Molly a Gen Zer compared to my Gen X status. My mother just jumped over the millennials completely and went straight to Gen Z. So like all teens, Molly's story is distinct, but its themes resonate with what my research and research conducted by others has shown when it comes to teens who are exploring and expressing one or more marginalized identities. Molly came out to me as liking girls more than boys during their senior year of high school. And while I was writing Technology's Child, they shared with me that they were using they, them pronouns and exploring a trans identity. And for Molly, the internet was formative in their experiences as a teen and emerging adult exploring these identities. Tumblr in particular, which is a social media platform that some of you may be familiar with, others perhaps not so much, but Tumblr provided a really supportive and affirming space. This is where Molly was first introduced to fan fiction, which addressed and celebrated queer identities in a way that Molly had never encountered before. Fan fiction and the community surrounding it gave Molly the conceptual frame to start making sense of how they were feeling inside. And these online experiences also gave them a sense of validation. For the first time, they started to feel that what they were feeling inside was okay. And this really, unfortunately, stood in stark contrast to the loneliness and isolation that Molly was feeling in their all-girls school, where gender nonconforming identities were not even discussed, let alone accepted. So Molly's experiences on Tumblr gave them a feeling of self-direction that was really hard for them to achieve at school. And even so, the internet was not an unmitigated positive in Molly's life. And for too many teens, their networked interactions are a source of stress, even as they offer positive experiences. My research and research of others shows that too often it's difficult for teens to feel in the driver's seat of their digital experiences. It's difficult for them to experience a sense of self-direction when they're engaged with social media. And part of the reason for this, although certainly not the whole reason, can be found in the way that technologies are designed. And here again, design really does matter. So let's consider some specific features that are common across many social media platforms and how they might undermine a sense of self-direction. So the ability to scroll endlessly through a feed that's algorithmically curated to show compelling content. Now, this combination of features, which by the way, were not always there at the beginning of social media. At the beginning of social media, there was no infinite scroll. Feeds were not necessarily algorithmically curated, but more chronologically curated. But this particular combination of features we have now can be a strong pull on a teen's attention. It can be a strong pull on our attention, but especially when teens are still developing their executive function skills. It's really hard to feel in the driver's seat in this context when you have such a pull on your attention. Consider also likes, comments, and tagging. All of these metrics help to shape what the algorithm prioritizes. They're also a very visible and quantifiable way to signal peer group affiliation, popularity, who's in and who's out, which of course we know, especially in early adolescence, is really front and center. And the notifications that are delivered whenever you receive a like, a comment, or when you're tagged in someone else's post, these notifications call attention, sometimes constant attention, to these metrics, and they underscore their importance. Now, all of these features shape what you can do on a social media platform. They shape what gets seen and what is not valued. And importantly, what is done, what is seen, and what is valued tends to emphasize content and behaviors that capture attention and not content that supports feelings of self-direction and well-being. So if you recall Paw Patrol Rescue Run, you might think of these kinds of social media features as social media pup treats that are just keeping you inside of the platform. These features are hard enough for us adults to manage, but they're even harder for teens who are considerably more sensitive to social feedback and whose self-control's toolbox is still very much under construction. Now, here's one way I offer in the book to think about how design interacts with human behavior and motivation. So on the bottom here, you've got the feature layer, and these are the individual design decisions like infinite scroll, like buttons and filters. These features make possible certain actions and they prevent others. And so on the practice layer, the features interact with individual motivations and tendencies, and they shape the possibilities for action on this particular platform, whatever it may be. And this is where you find affordances like visibility, persistence, anonymity or pseudonymity, spreadability. How far can your posts be seen and by whom? And the practices that get established through these affordances, these possibilities for action, eventually they form specific cultures. And so the cultures that you find on Instagram are going to be different from the cultures that you find on Tumblr or Be Real. And within those platforms, you're going to find many subcultures as well. And so this model helps to show how specific design decisions interact with human behavior, and they shape the kind of experiences that teens have online and the cultures that they are part of. Now, this discussion also points to the fact that yes, design matters, but so do the individuals who are interacting with the design and their specific contexts. So although there are clearly patterns to the challenges that teens face on social media, in large part because of the way these sites are designed, it doesn't work quite the same way for all teens. And that's because not all teens are the same and not all contexts are the same. So for instance, let's say you have two teens who are looking at the exact same content on TikTok, but one happens to have low body satisfaction and the other doesn't. So these two teens are going to react probably quite differently to the images they come across on their social media feeds. Or you might have two teens with similar vulnerabilities to body satisfaction, but their surrounding contexts are quite different. Maybe one teen has a supportive adult or friends who help them to reframe what they're seeing online, encourage them to curate their feeds so that they're encountering body positive content rather than more thinspiration type content. You can see here how the second part of the framework comes in, community support. Community support is absolutely essential for youth's positive digital experiences. It's not the case that it's all up to them to figure out how to make their digital experiences positive. No, there's a whole community around them that really needs to be leveraged to support teens and all youth, really. So by community support, I mean technology experiences that are supported by others, either during a particular technology experience or surrounding the experience. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean here. So if we start with younger kids and thinking about what are the kinds of supports that are surrounding their digital experiences, a lot of this support comes from caregivers and sometimes siblings. So if we return to Oliver's interactions with Peppa's paint box, there are several supportive community-related roles that I, as a caregiver, can take on. So I can be a gatekeeper. I can decide what content that Oliver has access to and for how long. I can monitor what he's doing while he's engaged with a digital experience. I can take a more active role, maybe by joining in and contributing to his picture or asking him to describe it to me. Maybe I connect it to some other experience that we've had recently. And these roles apply to older children and teens, but the roles tend to expand somewhat as kids get older. So parents may still act as gatekeepers and monitors, especially in early teen years when their child gets a first phone or joins social media platforms for the first time. They can still participate with their older children and teens, such as families who play video games together. But some additional forms of support during these older years include things like asking children about their digital experiences and really listening with empathy to what they have to say. Maybe helping them to reframe some of their experiences that are causing them stress. So for instance, maybe pointing out how much effort tends to go into creating and posting attractive images online. Or for instance, if a friend hasn't responded to a message right away, maybe consider reasons why that might be the case that have nothing to do with whether that friend likes you or not. So maybe they're having dinner, or they aren't allowed on their phone until their homework is done, or maybe their phone battery has died. Parents might also share their own personal struggles with managing their tech use, including strategies that they've come up with to manage these challenges, like disabling notifications or putting their phone on do not disturb during certain hours. Now, in some cases, parents and children, these would be ideal cases, might come up with strategies together as they identify challenges that they have in common. And by the way, I've done some research showing that The way parents and the way teens talk about their relationships to their phones is very similar. So although the specifics of the challenges might be different, they're generally very similar. And so I think there's a lot of common ground to be had here. So that with that common ground, they can talk with each other to come up with some shared strategies, such as maybe placing the phone in a different room to avoid checking it throughout the night. Now, an important thing to note here is that these supportive roles can be assumed by a much broader set of people, not just parents. So friends, teachers, siblings, extended family members, health professionals, and other community members can and do provide these forms of community support. Sometimes the support comes from within the platform, such as when Molly found a supportive community on Tumblr. A lot of the times, though, it comes surrounding the digital experience. And sometimes the platform itself, including how it's structured and how it's governed, can provide a source of community support. So, for instance, platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube have recently introduced features such as time limits, take a break nudges, disabling autoplay, and making accounts private by default for teens, all in an effort to promote teens' well-being in their social media use. And this point calls attention to the fact that, once again, design matters. How companies design their features really matters, but also it really underscores the fact that community support is more than parents, peers, and teachers. It's the tech designers and the industry they work for. It's government policies such as the UK's age-appropriate design code, which spurred companies like Instagram and TikTok and YouTube to make changes to their default settings for teens. And they really did as a result of that legislation being passed. It's also researchers like me whose work can help, hopefully, guide policies and designs that support children's healthy development and well-being with technology. And this brings me back to the two roles that I identify most closely with right now, parent and researcher. And I want to conclude my talk by reflecting on how I'm using this two-step framework to help guide what I do in each of these roles. So as a researcher, my current work is focused on identifying specific designs that either support and undermine healthy development, especially during the teen years. And some of these designs are already existing, and some we are developing in our lab to try and make social media a better experience for teens. My collaborators and I are also investigating ways to detect when things are going well and when they're not going so well as teens are interacting with social media in real time. And as a parent, I use the framework as a tool to guide my decision-making pretty much every day around Oliver's tech use. And by asking every day, is this experience self-directed? Is it community supported? I feel like I'm putting the research to work for my specific situation and for my individual child. And in that way, the complex becomes concrete, and I have a better sense of when to turn off Paw Patrol. I'm also learning to be a good enough digital parent. And I just want to end with this idea for those of you who are parents. The idea comes from a pediatrician, Donald Winnicott, who wrote a long time ago, back in the mid-20th century. Now, back then, times were different. He wrote about the good enough mother, but I've updated it for the 21st century, and I talk about the good enough parent. So the idea is that the goal of parenting is not perfection. It's not being there for your kid 100% of the time. Rather, the goal is good enough. In fact, if you're always there to respond to your child's every bid for attention, you're actually doing them a disservice, because they don't get to figure out how to solve their own problems. They don't get to figure out how to calm themselves when they're upset, or how to get unbored if they're feeling bored and don't know what to do next. So a good enough parent lets their child struggle through these kinds of experiences, knowing that it will build resilience in them. So a good enough digital parent, similarly, doesn't settle for imperfection, but rather embraces it. They do their best to steer their kids towards self-directed community support experiences knowing that not everything is going to be stellar. And in my household, that is certainly the case. And I think there's actually a lot of time, and there's many times where it's just perfectly fine for us both to just crash on the couch and watch some TV and really not have a particularly self-directed experience. It's okay to do that. It's okay to make mistakes, but then a good enough digital parent will learn from those mistakes and shift direction as needed. They may not watch an entire episode with their child or become an expert gamer, but they will show genuine curiosity and empathy with what their children are engaging in. And when it comes to their own technology use, a good enough digital parent tries to limit their tech use around their kids as much as possible, but they take solace in research showing that occasional glances at your phone is not going to be doing any major damage, any damage at all to your children. They also recognize that it's not all on parents to figure out. So parents didn't create these challenges with technology, and so it shouldn't all be on them to solve them. The tech companies, policymakers, all of researchers all have a role to play. And good enough digital parents kind of relax into that, knowing that yes, they have a big responsibility, but it shouldn't all be on them. So what about you? How might you use this two-step framework in your roles as a UW employee, a researcher, a parent, or someone who has kids in their lives? And I'll just end my talk with that. I'm happy to take questions. And if you want to learn more, you can sign up for my occasional newsletter on my website. But it's really an honor to be able to address my fellow UW colleagues today. And I'm really excited to share this work with you all.